Hello and welcome to another episode of Igalia Chats. I'm Eric Meyer, a developer advocate at Igalia.
And I am Brian Cardell, also a developer advocate at Igalia. And for today, we have a special episode about the W3C, and we have a special guest. Guest, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, yeah, happily. This is Seth Dobbs. I'm the CEO at the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C. And Eric, Brian, thanks for having me. Really pleasure to be here today.
Yeah, definitely. Really pleasure to have you on the show. Yeah, so we thought we would talk about all things W3C from what it is and where it came from and how it's evolved over the years and maybe what is and isn't working and yeah, with your role. So you're CEO of W3C, which was created in 1995, right?
Yeah, W3C was founded in 94, I think. We celebrated 30 years of existence last fall. So
That's right. That's right.
yeah.
It's based on this idea from the X consortium, like how it would be set up. Tim wrote about that a little bit in his book.
Yeah.
It didn't have a CEO until when?
The CEO was kind of put in place in 2002.
Mm-hmm.
Steve Brad, I believe, was the name.
Hmm.
And then Jeff Jaffe in 2010. Ralph Swick, our current COO, he has been interim kind of in between each stage, kind of filling in and taking the reins to keep things moving while new searches were performed.
I found this fascinating because when I got involved in standards, I very carefully read the process and all that stuff. And like, in order to join the W3C, you needed to have effectively some kind of legal entity. But the W3C itself wasn't a legal entity because it was like this funky, like
Hosted model, as we say. It was
yeah,
initially hosted by MIT. Yeah, MIT basically, I think, sponsored it initially, essentially, and was providing the resources, salaries for the MIT-based team, as well as office space and stuff like that, and a place basically ultimately to be collecting member dues. URSUM in Europe, I believe, actually technically INRIA and then URSUM in Europe was, we just celebrated 30 years in Europe a couple months ago. So they were the first next partner that was also willing to commit resources and effort and stuff like that. Then Keio University in Japan, not too long after. Beihang in China came a little bit later. It wasn't quite as quick a follow, but still, gosh, I think at least 20 years, I think we recently just celebrated, if I recall correctly. So each of those kind of hosted an effort, so that you're correct, until about 2.5 years ago. It wasn't a single entity. It was literally a consortium that included these 4 hosts and then all the different member organizations as well. That changed going into, I think 2022, they spent a lot of time really looking at, okay, how do we separate out, form a corporation, and launched in 2023, or technically December 31st, maybe on in 22, the 501c3 public interest nonprofit organization. And they started a new CEO search, and that's where how I got appointed.
My perception of it, and I think the way that it was described to me in at least a few cases, was that Tim was essentially benevolent dictator for life.
Well, I've heard that, yeah.
Yeah, which can make some people's hackles rise a little bit. And he wasn't a dictator per se, but he was sort of the last word, right? Like
Right.
if technically, organizationally, usually if there was some completely unresolvable thing, it would go to Tim and Tim would make a decision. From what I've seen, he would always try to make a decision in the best interest of the forward progress of the web, but
Yes,
that's what the director role was. And now we don't have that. Tim has stepped away and we have a CEO, you. Yeah, it's interesting that the W3C has a CEO, but it's also supposed to be director free. Like, how does that work?
yeah, it's a very different role than Tim. Tim played a unique function. I mean, Tim's played a unique function kind of in the world to a certain extent, certainly in W3C and with the web. And so a lot of his role as a director, we had CEOs of the consortium in parallel to having the director, right? And so they're actually kind of different functions. As the director, he was really in some ways ultimately kind of, in my mind, the technical director, sort of moving forward the entire program. And that work is really, and he helped and deliberately paved the way to transition that part of the evolution of the process over, particularly over the last, I'd say maybe 5 years, was getting to a point where, as far as developing standards and stuff like that, membership really was driving that with support from team. We obviously, team members, we have really smart people. We have some ideas. We work with the different working groups. It's a good partnership, but there's no authority embedded in W3C team or even myself to say, this will be the standard, that won't. Not that Tim necessarily had that heavy hand in exercise, but certainly he had a lot of the respect and I think some of that authority. I don't. I'm really responsible for ultimately making sure that the corporation is durable and therefore the consortium, right? And so I think a lot about our financial flow. I think a lot about our operations. I think a lot about membership, in particular, acquisition, retention, engagement, making sure, we have clear sense of purpose to guide us and stuff like that, but not necessarily really making all the decisions on the standards itself.
It's interesting the way that not only did the W3C move from being not a legal entity to being a legal entity, but it also moved from having sort of a final arbiter, one person who was the final arbiter for everything. Now there isn't a final arbiter really of everything.
Yeah, I think in some ways, I think that's pretty fair, and I think it's good. The councils, we have like formal objection councils. We have various councils that consist of typically myself with only a single vote, and then our two main elected bodies, operational elected bodies, TAG, the Technical Architecture Group, and the AB, our advisory board, both elected by membership. And so in some cases where there's like true arbitration of certain things, this is the group that meets. And so it's made it a little bit more, probably democratic. I think it often, to your point, it operated that way most of the time, unless. Now the new unless isn't just one person, which is, I'll say sitting here, probably a reasonable thing. I think finding that next one person that would be the final arbiter would have been a very hard thing to get people to agree to be fair. And certainly not what I saw it in pursuing. Like I understood this wasn't replacing Tim, right? This role that I have, CEO, was really about, running the organization, steering the organization, and working with membership to continue to evolve the web. I will say, team also helps facilitate sometimes where there's conflict or disagreement. We can sometimes be that neutral party. We don't have our own commercial interests, but we don't have that the authority that Tim had. We just have the ability to help step in and sometimes help people hear each other and bring things to the front as needed.
Yeah. And you said that you weren't trying to replace Tim. I'm just wondering, did you apply? Were you sought out? What was that process like? What is it like to apply for, just to even interview for CEO of the Stewards of the Web?
Yes. It was in some ways it was kind of a wild ride just to try. So, and I'd been at my last place for about 20 years. I hadn't interviewed in a few decades before going into this. So it was kind of a fascinating experience, but the short version, a former colleague that's involved in accessibility had shared the posting for the job search on LinkedIn. And another colleague of mine actually saw it and sent it my way saying, hey, this looks like something that would be really great for you, really interesting and stuff. And I'm CEO of W3C, having been in web development for most of the existence of the web, while I haven't worked on the standards, very familiar with it. It just seemed like an amazing opportunity, and reading the whole profile and stuff on the expectations and the need and the moment in time, this conversion from four sort of collaborating universities and research facilities to a single corporation that partners with some of those still. It just seemed like a really great challenge. I sent them my cover letter and resume. I got an initial screen with the recruiter, which was just, incredibly exciting even to make it that far. So I went through that initial screening, and that went really well. It was fortuitous. I had recently launched a leadership podcast. I've done a lot of like leadership coaching and training throughout, probably the latter stage of my career. And that gave me something to direct them to when he asked me things like, well, what is your leadership style? And I obviously gave him a summary and was able to point to that. But not having standards background, not having a nonprofit background, I really wasn't sure how far I'd go, but I made it to the Zoom panel. So that was with board members, the hiring committee, and that was probably hour and a half. I can't remember exactly, but basically answering questions from each of the members of the committee and responding and asking my own questions. Then there were time lags, as those of you familiar with W3C, everything is consensus driven. So the timeline wasn't quite what was initially promised, but fortunately the recruiter did a good job of kind of keeping me informed. And then I was invited out to Wakefield, Massachusetts for an in-person. I think the final three all came in over the course of a few days, and almost all the hiring committee came in. And so we had an in-person panel. I had to do like a presentation. We had lunch, so we had some casual time and stuff so we could get to know each other. So it was actually the questioning and stuff like that, I'll say, was pretty thorough. They did a really, pushed on a lot of different things. And as I said, fortunate enough in the end, just delighted when I got the email saying that I was getting an offer. Truly, really, really exciting day. I think I was on a call with someone and I was trying to quickly hang up so I could run and, tell family and friends and stuff.
You had said in that like you didn't have a standards background. So it's like kind of my next question is like, what was your relationship with standards before this? Because it seems like, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what it's like I don't know what it's like to be a CEO. I've never been a CEO, but there's a part of me that feels like, it'd be awfully really handy to have a good grip on the problem space at least, but maybe it's better to not. And I don't know. I was just kind of curious because I don't really know a lot about your background. We had a nice meeting in California last year, got to sit down and talk a little bit, but we didn't actually get into that. I will say a thing that's really nice is that you did spend an awful lot of time listening to me, which I appreciated. If you could just tell me like what was your relationship to standards? Yeah.
Great question. And certainly something that was obviously a key, I'll just say, conversation topic during the interview. So my perspective, I haven't worked on standards, but I'm a big believer in them, in the impact in particular. Long before I even knew this job was possible. I mean, for much of my career, I've spoken and been constantly just amazed at not just the creation of the web, but it's being put into public domain and being guided by standards. I mean, truly world changing, right? Like we'd have 20 versions of AOL, there'd be 5 UK OLs, right? Like, just imagine what the world would be. Imagine what our jobs would be. It's completely different. It's actually hard to envision what that would be like. And so I'm a huge believer, particularly in the impact of what the web is and what the web does. And that happens because of the standards. And that's really that's my biggest driver of why I'm here. But my focus really as CEO is to, I think, help improve the impact of them, right? As we, look to the future, I think there's a lot more to be done. There's a lot more of the world perhaps that hasn't been touched by the web yet, that might have different constraints, different needs. Understanding those problems, understanding the kind of human problems, the world problems that these standards can help solve, understanding the impact that interoperable implementations of them and of our horizontals and such can have. That's really where a lot of my focus is. And then communicating that potentially to, now that we're a nonprofit, I can work with potential donors, with funders, with foundations and things like that, where we can find aligned interests. Some have said to me, it's hard to see, standards are great, they're important, but they're not necessarily, are they aligned with our values? And I've been able to make the case in a couple cases now explaining the impact that, yes, in fact, this is really in line with what you want to do because of all the different things these standards enable. So that's really my relationship, right? A believer in what they do and the impact of them, and a deep appreciation for the people truly that spend, the countless and often thankless hours in like putting it in doing the actual work and the debates and all that to get to a point where we have recommendations that people implement.
There was something you said there that I'm a little interested in. You said parts of the world that the web hasn't touched yet.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I was under the impression that there were basically no parts of the world that the web hadn't touched. So I'm just wondering
Yeah, it's a
what you mean
good
by that.
question. Maybe to clarify. So roughly, I think we're around 68% of the world is considered active on the web. So active is maybe the stronger, which in one
Okay.
sense is incredible.
Yeah.
Right. But in the other sense, and talking to Sue, a colleague, a business leader in I think from Argentina, when I said that, his immediate response is, so 32% really of the world are not really active, and what are they missing, and how are they being left behind and stuff like that, which is the perspective I really try to maintain as we think about it, right? Not to sort of rest on the laurels like 68% is amazing. It's billions. Although also, I think I heard a statistic, roughly 70% of the users are on a 2 or 3G network as well, right? So there's constraints. As I sit here in my gigabit service and giant monitor, I've got dozens of devices connected to my internet, multiples running video and stuff like that. It's hard to think about what 2G and 3G is. So that probably could have some focus. So we also don't have a lot of representation in W3C from the global south. And that's something I think there's, perhaps some at least indirect cause and effect in that. And so a lot of my thinking about the future is thinking about how to change that. But that's basically what I meant. I'm sure there's people that have not ever seen the web, don't know what it is. Is it the
Sure.
30%? No. But are people's lives affected the way, certainly here in the United States where I sit and stuff like that are definitely that's not necessarily common when you look at sort of the structure of networks and things like that.
Yeah. And I think a figure you put in there is really important. Of the 68% of the world that are on the web actively,
Yeah.
70% of them are on 2G or 3G.
Yes.
That's
Yes.
huge.
It is. It's actually, it kind of weighs heavily a little bit on me because I just, you look at the network consumption of downloading your average page and stuff like that with all the stuff that we have in it. And that's just
Yeah.
that's not feasible in a 2G and a 3G network to be actively, useful. Never mind sort of the cost of equipment to handle the speed of cell phone, right? In less wealthy nations. Cheaper hardware is going to be the main way things move forward. They have limited memory and all that stuff. So I think that's something, I think that's a challenge that's really in front of us because I don't think the 2G and 3G nature of the world changes that quickly, especially when you start reaching, never mind the existing, when you reach out to the remaining population that doesn't really have, that are in concentrated areas without service. Even in the United States, even in UK, even in other nations such as that, there are pockets of poorer service, of less activity and things like that. So there's sort of, in some ways there's two unserved or underserved constituencies that I think perhaps we could take some time to know more about and figure out if there's a way to create standards that enables solutions that meets the constraints in those regions and helps support whatever functions in their society are necessary.
The three of us are all involved in W3C. We all know about, W3C and how it works and everything, but I think a lot of our listeners probably don't. So to avoid just skipping over some of the, lingo that's been used and everything and be able to get at some of the questions that I'd like to ask, I just wanted to say, like, you talked about these elected bodies. We've talked about the process document. And so basically, when you join the W3C, your organization gets a single representative. That's advisory committee representative, the AC rep, who has the ability to cast a vote, let's say. The process is sort of like it's our constitution in a way, that the AC is held to and responsible for, but it lays out how things work, and it lays out how things progress along recommendation track, and how votes are cast and how votes are counted, and all these different things. And I believe also that there is a CEO, for example. So the reason I bring this up is, where does the CEO and the team fit into this? Because it sounds very much about the members, and that the members, show up, and the members do the work, and the members vote, and the members. So where does the CEO and the team fit in? I think a lot of people must wonder. So let's give them an answer.
Yeah, it's great questions. I think maybe starting with the team, because as in any organization, right, it's your team, it's the staff that's really doing the majority of the work of the organization. The short version is typically the team proposes, after working with membership through preceding processes that I won't go into, proposes basically a charter to create a recommendation and to form a working group in kind of the simplest terms. That is one of the early consensus seeking moments in the process. And sometimes there's questions, sometimes there might be objections. I mentioned briefly earlier, there's a council that will handle the objections and address that with support from the team and things like that. So that's in some ways one of the first big moments, is making this, we're committing resources both on behalf of team and on behalf of consortium members to actually work towards a recommendation. Moving that through the process, in some cases we have people that are fairly deep technical experts on team that get into specific working groups to help just provide contribution. We can think about, areas like internationalization. We have Richard Ishida and Fuchiao. They are not just experts in not just multilingual, like they understand language, which is a different thing entirely when you start thinking about how do we enable languages and scripts on lines and stuff like that. And there's only a few people with the level of that kind of understanding plus technology. And we're fortunate enough to have some on staff. So there's just, just to give one example, we have quite a few in security and privacy and accessibility and things like that we enhance some of the work by being able to contribute to the conversation with deep knowledge. But core to all the team contacts, whether or not they have the relevant technology experience in whatever working group they're supporting, is helping move the process forward, is doing our best to kind of support and enable the chairs, enable the group to do their work. So that's a big piece of it. We also do some work we do think a lot about sort of the technology strategy, right? So that takes some thinking, it takes some work, which also is done in conjunction, in particular with the TAG, our technical architecture group, and membership in general. But that's a lot of where our technical work is done, is first bringing something to life and then supporting it. The last thing I guess I'll say for the moment on that, we drive horizontal review is one of the things we talk about at W3C, and it's fairly distinct in terms of standards development organizations, or SDOs. In that we don't just have each sort of recommendation sit by itself. Beyond that, we also have a marketing and communication team, another big piece, in part just keeping track of 46 or 47 working groups and the hundreds of other interest groups, community groups, the 350-ish members, there's, I think, 15,000 contributors, and something 30% of that is based on member employees. So keeping everyone informed is a non-trivial task. We've recently hired a chief development officer as well, and so she's here to help, work in part, benefit from some of that, and help drive some of that external communication, to work with potential sponsors, to work with foundations and things like that to raise funds. So those are some of the big parts of the team. Obviously, another huge part is our SIS team. They provide both the internal team IT support. So making sure our own networks, our own, hardware and software and stuff that we need is there. But they also provide support and in many cases develop the tools that the community uses to communicate, to develop standards, to work, all that kind of stuff. So that is making sure all the hosting's correct. They went through a major project to migrate out of MIT shortly after I started here. That was completed. That was huge. And then my job, I guess, going back to, so what does a CEO do? So there's a lot to orchestrate there, right? Part of it is working. I appreciate, Brian, you commenting on how much I listened. I do think that's a center to a CEO's job is listening. I can't really make good decisions without understanding things. And so a lot of my job in part is listen to membership, listen to other stakeholders and potential stakeholders. Be they potential members, be they policymakers looking to understand our standards better, to figure out ideally how to maybe inform policy with some of what our community's done. All sorts of potential there. So that's a part of it, is really a lot of stakeholder management, both in team, in membership, but also even in the outside world. Financial management, I have the responsibility of making sure we're a healthy organization, that we have a viable future as far as that goes, that we continue to be funded to do the work that we need, to listen for those opportunities. I think historically and understandably, we being heavily funded by member fees, there's sometimes a lot of appetite, even amongst membership, to do things. But when it comes to, well, how do we support it? How do we pay for it? We get into these kind of discussions of, well, if we do A, we can't do B. If we do B, we can't do A. And this has happened both amongst the community as anywhere. And so part of my job is to hear, to not just let those conversations be silenced, but to hear where there's important things that the community thinks need to be developed, that collectively we all believe is part of the future of the web, and figure out how we can make it happen.
I feel like also there are legal aspects to what you have to do in terms of holding patents and searching for patents and, protecting this, and then organizing events. There's not just that happens in person, but then there's also workshops sometimes that are in person, sometimes that are virtual. There's really a lot of things that W3C does. And I'm glad that you mentioned that the membership frequently has an appetite that's bigger than their ability to figure out how we're going to do it, because it's not just membership. I mean, I think that's a really common thing, that we need to find ways to glue it to reality. And I think this is an interesting point where there's several things we could talk about. For example, historically, W3C has been a membership organization. This is how much it costs to join. And once you join, you can put unlimited number of people onto working groups and things like that. But mainly funding is about membership, right? And you mentioned in there, other things we can do with foundations, or are there other kinds of fundings that we can get from grants, from governments, from, I don't know how much we've explored these things, but a lot of the work that we do has to do with, internationalization, accessibility, important things that deserve to be funded. And I don't know. What do you think about looking into increasing ways of funding that aren't just about membership, or maybe even looking into more creative kinds of membership? I know some people, Corley and I, among them, were looking for a long time at is there some way we can have sort of an individual membership of some kind?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's something I think a lot about, something I've been starting to be more active on. And one of the, I'll say, challenges of a member-driven organization is the conflating of income with the work that's done. And so our work is done by membership and our funding is done by membership, which is obviously it's a good system. It works, but sometimes it gets us hard to separate participation, which is maybe the notion of individual memberships. We have invited experts that can come in, which is a different program. Not just anyone can do that. We might want to have a filter on that. So there's almost two questions there in my mind, which is how do we bring the right people, however you decide what that means, to a particular table to have a discussion around a standard, right? And how do we have enough of the people to ensure the right inputs into it to make sure it's a meaningful standard that is then going to actually be embraced and implemented in a truly interoperable fashion? And then how do we fund doing all those activities? So I actually do think of them separate, even though about 90% of it is the same, right, today. But I think to a point you're making, Brian, I want to talk a little bit about the history of our funding and then more about the future. As a 501c3, I think we have a greater opportunity than ever to seek that. Now, we have been funded by grants in the past, and I think some in Europe, some in the US. We've had an HHS grant. We have a Ford Foundation grant. I think we released a press release now. I can't remember how long ago, but a 2-year grant from them, primarily focused around accessibility. A lot of our accessibility work and internationalization work has given us grants. A lot of the accessibility work has actually been funded heavily by grants over the years. So the Ford Foundation is our first as a new corporation. First, but for sure not last, because I think that just it gives us an opportunity to do to fulfill our mission with more than just standards. A lot of our web accessibility initiative, or WAI, W-A-I, works on the standards, but also works on so many different supporting tools to enable implementers, developers, designers, et cetera, to truly understand accessibility so that it actually gets implemented well from start to finish. And that's an important part of fulfilling the mission for Web for All, is doing that kind of enablement. So some of the funding's been around providing training and resources and things like that. Additional funding also can help us prove out interoperability. There's some proof of concept discussions we're in right now for projects to actually take some standards that haven't been truly implemented in the field yet and see if there's an opportunity to do that in conjunction with the actual work itself. There's been opportunities to look at accelerating processes or accelerating work around a specific standard. So I think these tools give us some additional, whether it's through a foundation, through member organization, sometimes will fund bringing us together to make sure things get done. That's happened occasionally. So there's a few different ways we can do this. And the more we can kind of build that up, the more flexibility we have in terms of how do we think about our membership and their ability to come in and do work. How do we bring in the right people? So there's sort of this cycle of back and forth in my mind of being able to hopefully progress in how we're funded and have a larger percent than 10% of our funding being non-member fee based, and then seeing what that provides us and how we can continue advance the mission and get more participation in the work that we do.
Things that haven't been implemented. Can you say more about that?
We're looking at opportunities to, hey, can we get everyone in a room ahead of TPAC? So for those that aren't W3C people that are listening, TPAC is our annual gathering where we actually bring a pretty high percentage of our working groups come together in one place. We get probably 20 plus operating in parallel in different rooms in a convention center or a hotel, and face to face. And while we do so much of our work virtually, and as CEO of W3C Inc., I believe heavily in using the web to get a lot of stuff done. Sometimes you need to get people in the same room just to drive some stuff forward. And we still we can't get everyone in. There's a whole bunch of reasons people can't make it into the room. And so we still try to facilitate remote access to that and stuff like that, just to be clear, because that kind of accessibility is truly, truly important. And there's so many different reasons people can't, don't, or won't travel. But we find sometimes it is helpful to get everyone in, I will say, time zone synchronization at a minimum. To be able to not lose days in a conversation. I think that's one of our biggest challenges, and it's the same in any global standards development organization. we're not all in the same time zone. Literally, the sun never sets on W3C. While we don't have a footprint in certain continents to a certain extent. If you go, east to west, we cover almost every time zone. Team does. With some recent additions, I think there isn't an hour on a weekday there isn't someone that's actually awake and working. And so that's great in some ways, right? It's amazing that so many people from so many different parts of the world are working on this stuff. But it also sometimes means, especially if you've just simply tried to schedule a meeting with people across, an 18-hour span of time zones, it can take 2 days just to get to an agreement of when to have something. And so discussions can sometimes just take this long rotation as people read, digest, and things like that. And that can make some work slow or take longer, I should say, to execute. And so there's a lot of advantage sometimes. That's why we do TPAC. One of the big things that we do there is get this synchronous time. And there have sometimes been meetings throughout the year where a group will say, hey, we need to get together. Being able to fund that and to accelerate that, I think is something that's very exciting. Standards organizations are somewhat notoriously not swift, I'll say. There's reasons for not just quickly knocking out a standard. Right? To be very clear and very fair, there is an appropriate time that's taken, but there's various reasons that sometimes things just time elapses without progression of work. And so being able to get that synchronous time and being able to maybe find ways to fund more of that, I think would be incredibly meaningful. Both to our to W3C, to our membership, but to the world, because that brings improvements out into the web.
You mentioned a little bit back that the W3C recently published a vision statement.
Yes.
When was that, and what is the vision?
Let's see. So our vision was published July 29th. This has gone through a fairly long process to gather input in writing it, in approving it across our membership. As Brian, I think, mentioned earlier, the consensus notion of not necessarily voting, but saying, yeah, this is an estate that we feel ready to put this out into the world. So we went through all
consensus driven. It takes time.
It takes time. It takes time to get this. I'll say I'm impressed because it's hard to crowdsource a meaningful vision. It actually tends to be a diluting effect. And I'm actually very, very happy with the work that was done here. I'll say the core vision briefly, because there's a longer document. Anyone that's interested will maybe post a link with the show notes.
Yep.
I think it's worthwhile because it includes a core vision, a longer description of it, and then really important to realize in a vision are operating principles. And so this provides a guidance, right? A good vision. I recently blogged about this as well, probably July 30th or 31st, I think it came out, on the importance of a vision and how it really provides guidance to especially such a broad organization. Helps with prioritization. It helps with alignment around decision making without it being prescriptive. That's a really important element. That balance is really important in vision. So the principles help emphasize what's important in operating and running and making the day-to-day. But the core vision, there's 4 key pieces that are the core vision of the World Wide Web. First is that the web is for all humanity. Second is that the web is designed for the good of all people. Third is that the web must be safe to use. And fourth, there is one interoperable World Wide Web, not the dozens of Nation Online or whatever it might be that I mentioned, but a single interoperable World Wide Web. This is really, in some ways, those of us that have been even developing on the web, never mind working in the standards, has been some of this has been fairly clear. Though interoperable in particular, I think, has always been just such a key drive. It's why even some of the largest corporations in the world are here in that belief that we're all better by having a single interoperable web than by having any kind of fractured or siloed version of it. But I think the first emphasis on the web for all humanity, and then second, good for all, or the good of all people, I think is a great statement to be made as a vision for a technology standards organization. The rooting in humanity and the needs of people and fulfilling that kind of purpose is part of the appeal to me, again, in coming here and in being a CEO of this organization. Something I can be very proud to represent and very excited to. So, but it's good. It provides a kind of guidance for the organization. And even though it hadn't been published yet, I had seen where it mostly was. There was a lot of internal work, and it helped drive some strategic initiatives that I recently worked with the board on, and other members of other elected bodies in our community to publish as well. So it really, a good vision, a good mission drives so much of what an organization does. And I believe this is the first clear vision statement that we've actually had as a community. 30 years in, it's none too soon from a leadership perspective. But I'll also say, as we've been just in this this moment of change, of changing, of Tim, our founder and the inventor of the web, leaving, of our corporate structure, trying to figure out what's next. This really roots us into the future in a way that I think is very positive.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that those 4 principles, as someone who has been involved with standards in W3C for a long time, I think they pretty accurately encapsulate or sum up what the W3C has always done. Even the web must be safe to use. I don't know if I would have put it that way if I'd been asked to, but all of the accessibility and security and privacy reviews that happen, that's what that's about. So It is a really good sort of distillation, even if it's the first vision statement the W3C has ever had. It's almost saying, well, this is what we've been doing. This has been the vision. We've just written it down now.
Right.
But it is always good to write these things down. Jeremy Keith had a talk, at least at one point, about if you have guiding principles, it's a real good idea to write them down, because then everyone can see them. So that's really, really nice to see that.
Particularly, I think, in the absence, we talked about the absence of a director, the formal role of being the final decision. It's not that individuals are making decisions. It's not even completely that groups are making decisions. They're making decisions in line with this vision.
You mentioned before that, there's this tension in the fact that you pay to be a member, but then you also pay to do the work. And there are implications to that, right? Practical implications. And I'm kind of grateful that the big companies have funded as much as they have and everything, but they overwhelmingly fund the working group in terms of participation. And so CS's working group, as an example, has 178 different participants, including 16 invited experts that represent 25 organizations. And 109 of those people, or 123 if you count Igalia, are from just the main vendors. And so, it's by far the vast majority of people are from those who show up and do a lot of the work. When you look at a specification that reaches recommendation or whatever, almost always the editor is associated with some big tech company. And it's because, well, it takes a long time to drive through all that stuff, and somebody has to fund their participation in their work. And, so there are gobs of proposals and standards and things that are brought by those other members. But effectively, we're trying to reason with these other companies to spend their budget, allocate their budget the way we believe it should be. And, to their credit, they do a lot of that, they do. But there are also ideas that are maybe important that don't get the attention that we would like, or maybe things that don't fit so well in the browser, like print is an example. For a long time, didn't get the attention that the browsers wanted to give it. I have thought for a long time now that, to this point that you made earlier about finding ways to ground things in reality, what if membership put money into a common pot, and there was something that bound that, where, at the end of the year, so much of this has to be spent on what membership agrees, some binding thing where we can't get everybody to get everything that they want. I really appreciate that beautiful idea that you have. I too want that thing, but these are the funds that we have. So which thing should we do? And I feel like if we did something like that, we would get more, how do we cooperate and achieve the things that are maybe on the fringes a little bit. So I just like to give you the opportunity to respond to that and tell me that's absolute hogwash and what a stupid idea.
In some ways, it's a complex question. In terms of participation, absolutely. Some organizations are much better funded. There are some very large organizations that only contribute a few people, interestingly, some that contribute a lot. And I want to say our largest group of member organizations are under 10 employees or members of it. That's actually the largest number that we have. So we do have an interesting balance. And so it's a good question, leading into what you're saying is how do we find that balance? To a certain extent, the membership, at least the way we operate today, the membership fees are that pool, and we work through the process to kind of prioritize. We are looking at ways of various flavors of incubation of sort of matriculation from early idea in a community group or an interest group, and how do we maybe better cull those for things that should move into standards work, into a working group to have more of the true formal process. Because again, for those that aren't involved in W3C, working groups are formal process groups. Community groups and interest groups are really open to pretty much anyone to come in and participate and have discussions in. They don't sort of create the recommendations, but they can be where a lot of preliminary work is done. In terms of like the actual so-called, as you say, voting that the advisory committee does, that's how a charter gets approved. Each organization has that one vote to approve that. Often it's mostly people that are interested in that particular piece of work that you see take the time to make a vote. So that gives you a gauge of participation. And so part of it is trying to find that balance. Definitely, we don't do that perfectly. I know we can't force people to participate in things that they aren't interested in. And because we have so many of these 10 or fewer people organizations, like their one person is participating in the one thing that is interesting to their business, important to their business. And so literally they ignore, understandably, I don't mean that in a bad way, but they don't pay attention to much of what else is going on. And I think to be clear, I think there's value in that, right? I think there's value that we are this gathering place where a narrow interest can still be a part of what's very important to them and still has an impact on the web. So how do we continue to prioritize that is the bigger question. How do we make sure things aren't lost? I do think the vision is a place that starts. One of the things that we're working on, it's one of the strategic initiatives that I've briefly alluded to, is around creating kind of an impact framework. And so that's not something we always think about in standards organizations, is the impact of the work that we do. But as I said, it's a lot of why I'm here, because I passionately believe in it. I think the more we can articulate through our vision, our mission, our horizontals, the change we're trying to create in the world, and look at ways to measure that, which is a lofty goal, but I think something we can do, that starts driving even more tangibly the conversations around, this is actually pretty important work because it feeds into this, and it has this impact on this part of society or this community or whatever. But I think that can sometimes help us, that can bring some clarity. That's taking the vision and taking it to the next step of, okay, what do we mean by Web for All? What do we mean by good for humanity? How do we know that we've even done something that approaches that? And that starts operationalizing, right, our vision, our mission, and hopefully starts creating perhaps different processes, different structures to do that. One of the things I'd certainly want to be able to figure out a way to, I'll say in quotes, measure is interoperability. It's not just, there's multiple browsers, but there's this level of security is available, not just on browsers. The web is accessed by so many different things now, right? There's publishing, which is, a kind of a branch off into EPUB and things like that. There's different devices. There's web of things where, again, we're interfacing with it. And so there's more than just measuring the browser when we think about interoperability, depending on what the standard is for. And so getting smarter about that can also potentially help drive, I think, some of what you're getting at, Brian, which is how do we push some of these other things forward that are more maybe global priorities. And so I'm hoping this starts giving us those mechanisms to even have that kind of conversation in a way that can be meaningful.
You're the CEO of the W3C. The W3C has a vision. But what's your vision? Like, what do you want the W3C to be like in the future, either immediately or long term after you've stepped down? And are there things that you think need to change, or things that you particularly think should not change?
I think we're only just scratching the surface, honestly. And so a lot of my vision, certainly for W3C, we celebrated 30 years. A lot of my internal talk was, well, I'm thinking about the next 30. I don't plan to be here for all 30, just to be clear. But making sure we're set up with all these changes, this inflection point that we're kind of in terms of Tim stepping down. And there's several technical standards organizations that are reaching this phase of so much momentum from early people, from inventors, from founders, from creators, but also just initial participants, whether on team or in membership. We have 30-year people here. There's a lot of momentum that's built by that. But at the same time, we're moving on to other things in our other stages of our life at that point. And so how do we continue that? How do I help ensure that our organization has this continuity into the future and is structured to do that? A W3C that is still making a meaningful impact on the world 10, 20 years from now, that's really what I hope future generations see, right? The ongoing, and are excited by the work and understand the import of it. So that's the biggest thing. An organization that's clear on the impact that it has on the world, because an organization that does that, whether it's for-profit or nonprofit like us, is far more successful because you have that clarity. And we have a lot of these pieces together, getting smarter, getting more capable, I should say, at measuring it, at articulating it, at demonstrating it in a way that's meaningful to the world and participants, whether it's by contributing to standards in one form or another or contributing money in the process of it, I think is important. So seeing a broader range of stakeholders involved is probably another big piece of that. And that's part of how I think we make sure we can listen to parts of the world where we're not prominent and serve them as well as serve our obviously the existing community. I think those are probably the two big things, I think about in the future. Having a clear process is good. I think there's some work going on now. There's been some talk of, now that we've kind of dust has settled on certain corporate things for the most part and stuff like that, what's next? And do we have a process that's fit for purpose in a rapidly changing world? It's cliche to say technology changes quickly, but I've been around for decades. We're at a pace that is stunning at times, and a formal multi-year process isn't the only tool we should have in our toolbox to support the world, because that's time consuming and it requires a certain amount of knowledge of what's needed to create a standard. But how do we enable industries that are moving quickly? And how do we bring communities in those industries together to have the conversations of, okay, what is at least our de facto? What are we trying to accomplish? What is maybe an underpinning? Let's not compete here, because that's literally what a standard ultimately is. Let's not compete at this level so we can innovate on this. Let's stop focusing parallel dollars in places that don't make sense. Those conversations I'd be really interested into getting more formally around in those explicit terms that are pre-standards work. And I think there's a need for that. I think it's one of the big questions that I receive, like, how do we handle this fast moving times? And there's a lot of ideas in the community. So
yeah, I think that some of the things that you said there that jump out at me about, basically the process that we have now is really good at some kinds of things. It's really good at CSS. Like, this is sort of like the flagship standard, I would say, yes, at W3C. But it is tricky. It is impossible to know which things will be successful before they're successful, right? And historically, I think that standards organizations don't have a great history at innovation. And I think another thing that I try to stress all the time is that no standards organization is frozen in time. They're all constantly evolving, trying to figure out how to do better. And they have changed an awful lot. Like W3C has, created community groups. We've created incubation. The process has evolved in a whole bunch of ways. I think that there's probably plenty more to do in that regard. Even back in 2014, I proposed to the AC that we should find a way to allocate money for studying the web, because we don't do that, and that is mainly left to people at like volunteers at the HTTP archive or people who are paid to do the HTTP archive. And I think we could learn a lot about what could be more easily standardized and find participants outside the norms looking at like different kinds of patterns that are used on the web. But I'm really keen on where we go from here and how we concretely, like what steps we take. How do we make sure that we're an attractive place to develop maybe the next big thing and make it conducive to standardizing the next big thing? I do see that there is efforts to standardize things in, like, MCP is a really popular thing right now, that people are standardizing how these AI agents can communicate. And I don't know where it's happening or if it's happening anywhere, but I would like to know that at least at some point there's like, maybe we should take this to W3C. Even if they don't, I'd like to hear that articulated and reasoned out. Do you know what I mean? Like, how do we?
Yes. Same. I mean, that's it's a good way of articulating another sort of thought and a strategy in some of my goals, which is being recognized as a place where people, by people that don't necessarily currently do work here, as a place that is an interesting, valuable place to bring ideas, to bring work like that. And that takes, a bit of communication and stuff like that, and proof points, and talking about it the right way. In terms of just kind of not sort of missing some of the rapidly moving changes. We can look at a lot of recent developments in the last 10 years, I'll say, in technology that have had a lot of hype. I will say a high financial hype cycle. And I say that just to separate. Hype doesn't mean that there isn't value. I said in a talk at a W3C event that in my career, the most overhyped technology I've seen is the web, because it took the U.S. stock markets 10 years to recover from the dot-com crash. And we're still here, and there's still a lot to do, and there's a lot of work to do. So separating sort of the froth, which I sometimes turns people off in our community and elsewhere, from actually understanding it, is one of the hard things that I think we need to figure out. So kind of the short version, to sort of what you said, we're becoming more aware. I think there's always members that feel that whatever the newest thing is, that it's an important thing. And I think being able to listen to that, and, one of our team members did a report on AI last year and really kind of evaluating the different ways it can impact the web. Is there going to be an AI standard? No. Are there going to be many? Like all standards, yes. Because there are different aspects that probably have appropriate standardization in different places, possibly data format for sharing and spreading, so we don't have to keep cranking through all the same kind of model generation, communication between them, conversational interfaces, things like that. We have concerns around provenance of information on the web, deepfakes and things like that, on preventing them from overburdening servers and stuff like that, from scraping it. Sort of, there's a robots.txt and the equivalent of that. There's a lot of different ways that AI impacts the web and vice versa. And then there's ways that AI has nothing to do with it potentially, right? Depending on the aspect of it. So we need to be good at threading that needle sometime of what's relevant now that we should be addressing. And that's also part of the strategic work. One of the key initiatives is laying exactly like, what are those attributes that we look for, that we can say, hey, this is something we should be talking about more. It starts there. And then, we actually should be talking about it a little bit more. Actually, this needs something. How do we pull then the right people here? Ideally, I'd like people to find us, but we can also pull when we see that there's web or enough web adjacency and work to build momentum within our existing membership that can then draw additional membership that are more purely rooted in the new space, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Well, Seth, I think we've kept you long enough. I mean, would love to keep talking about this for hours, but
yeah, great questions. Obviously, passionate about this stuff and love talking about it. So again, I appreciate y'all taking some time with me.
Oh, please. Thank you so much for taking time out of your CEO duties to talk to us about this. maybe we'll do a follow up at some point in the future, see where things are. But any last things people should look at or things you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully, listeners that haven't been involved in one way or another, there's come to w3.org to learn more about us. There's a lot of ways to get involved, whether it's participation, whether it's, reviewing stuff that we put out to the public, whether it's helping fund us. There's a lot of different ways you can help move our mission and vision forward. So please encourage everyone. Even if you do think you know us, I will say there's always more to learn about us.
Yeah, we'll drop about a half dozen links in the show notes to things that we mentioned here.
Awesome.
Thanks again, Seth, for joining us.
Thank you.
Great. My pleasure. Thank you.